Hey guys, it's Thorn. Long time no see. I'll say off the bat, I've been really sick, and I guess officially I've been diagnosed with bronchitis, but they kind of did it in this flippant sort of, it's definitely not the flu, therefore here's this other category sort of way. So who knows? Anyway, I was running a really high fever for a little over a week, and when the fever went away, I was left with a really, really terrible cough, and it is mostly gone, but I'm still kind of left with this weird, like, diaphragm spasm thing that's happening that overtakes me periodically. So let's just pretend it's not happening when it is and move on. Anyway, I partially wanted to check in, and also, I've had some stuff on my mind, but I was driving home from work today, and new new job is kind of a mixed bag, by the way. That's a really boring video that I won't be making. I mean, a job's a job, right? You guys know how it is, I'm sure. I'm glad to have it, at least. But anyway, I'm driving home from the new job, and I was watching a video that Keldon posted, and his video was also a video response, so I'll throw them up here in a second. But anyway, the subject was the concept of plastic witches, which Keldon kind of explains a little bit. Kind of explains. It's like a 14-minute video. He thoroughly explains it. Okay. Anyway, well, he's making pumpkin soup, which sounds really great right now, as most of my foods have been liquid. Anyway, so the concept of a plastic witch is in line with videos that I've made previously about aesthetic witchcraft and kind of this ongoing conversation about who's a real witch, and like Becky with the good hair at Whole Foods and whatever. And I've gotten a lot of comments, even when I'm not making videos. I'm still on YouTube all the time. I watch people's videos and I read the comments that people leave for me. And the last several comments I've gotten have been kind of off the deep end in some ways and off topic, but several have been from people who like clearly haven't watched the video, and some of the accusations they make about like how I'm, appropriating witchcraft from real witchcraft and ruining it because blah, 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 real witches, that kind of stuff. Like, I've been making videos about real witchcraft for seriously, for 5 years at this point. There are several. But I had kind of, wanted to kind of nuance that thinking. And I've had this on my mind for a while now, but Keldon's video brought it up for me again. And it's related again to not so much the debate over who's a real witch, because frankly, nobody's a real witch. That's not a thing. And this conversation is boring at this point. But it's related to the idea of, I feel like there's a question behind who's a real witch, and that question is ultimately, am I a real witch? There's a fundamental kind of insecurity that comes with asking that question. And I don't mean this as a criticism, because I think we all do this. I've definitely done this. When I go through my books of shadows and journals, from the very beginning, when I first read my first Scott Cunningham and Silver Ravenwolf books, I am obsessed with this idea of doing things right and being real. And what that means changes depending on kind of what books I'm reading, who I'm hanging out with, what tradition I'm studying, whatever the things surrounding me are, and whatever's trendy too, because none of these conversations are new, as Keldon pointed out, and as we've all pointed out. It's just that they're louder and more in your face now because we can be connected through Instagram every second of the day. And it's also true, and I'm actually turning into my father as I say this, but young people think that they're the first people to do everything. So I feel like I'm finally in this position where I can look at younger people, and I don't mean this dismissively. I mean, I guess if I'm my father, I am being dismissive, but I mean this in the kind of like inexorable, inevitable sort of way that like old people just become dismissive, where like, you know, I see people freaking out. I see like early 20-somethings freaking out about something on Tumblr, and I just kind of kick back with my like back pain and my gray hairs, and I'm just like, I remember doing this when I was 20, you know, or whatever. Like, people really do think that they've discovered problems for the first time, including myself, which is why I brought up those journals. But anyway, something that I kind of reflected on, like, as I was thinking about like my own concerns over realness and these kind of collective conversations that are happening, and thinking about how those questions are really rooted in insecurity about whether we're individually doing things right, it occurs to me that aside from the fact that nobody owns the word witch, the thing, like, pragmatically that is at stake for me personally, the thing that I run into, is that the utility of the word like ceases to be. When nobody owns the word and it doesn't really mean anything, then I meet somebody on the street who tells me that they're a witch, and instead of feeling like, yes, somebody else, I think, I don't know what that means. And increasingly I find that, like, when I got on Instagram, for example, because this is low-hanging fruit, when I get on Instagram and I look at witch hashtags, I don't necessarily have anything in common with those people. Like, Keldon pointed out too, like, claiming witch is by itself a political statement, and I think that's true, but it doesn't necessarily say a lot about like where your politics actually stand. Like, it says something about outsiderhood, but you got to remember too, like, the conservative, Republican, Confederate flag waving people who I live amongst, they think they're the outsiders too. Like, they think they're the down. God, I can't even speak now. They think that they're like the oppressed, marginalized group. Okay, so like, it's a political statement, but what exactly are the politics behind that? Like, that's an open question. So what we're left with, if you say you're a witch and I say I'm a witch, and those witchinesses don't necessarily overlap in useful ways, then we haven't actually learned anything about each other. So then what I'm left with is, well, what am I doing with the word? What are the practices? What are the personal practices doing that matter to me? And what I've realized as I've been kind of hacking away in this body of traditions for 20 whatever years is that question doesn't go away, no matter what kind of witchcraft you're practicing, no matter how many initiations you have, whether or not you're a coven leader, how experienced you are. Like, I'm writing books about this stuff at this point, right? So is fucking Keldon. And like that, those questions don't go away. So you have to really be secure about what that word means to you and what that means. Like, when you're alone. This is something that I've really wrestled with as a coven leader and as a coven member, just because, like, by definition, I'm doing something that is collective. It's communal. But at the same time, it's very solitary because I'm still going to go home to my own practice. People move, people die, people don't answer the phone, people freak out and stop talking to you, people, whatever. Like, people change, people get married and have babies, and they have other hobbies, and they convert, and they, like, whatever. But just kind of the reality is that you're not going to be with the same people your whole life, like, no matter what you're doing. This is like the army brat in me talking, right? Like, change is inevitable and you will end up alone, right? Like, I'm not trying to make it sound that bad, but you have to be okay with yourself. Like, what does your witchcraft look like when you're alone? Even if you're part of a tradition, even if you're teaching others, even if you're circling with others, even if you're part of something that's established, it has to have meaning, and you have to be able to kind of define where those boundaries are when you're by yourself. And I think for a lot of us, we're so invested in a witchcraft that is dependent on what other people are doing. This is the point Keldon was making in his video, where, you know, what Hannah the High Priestess 2 states over is doing doesn't have any bearing on what I'm doing. And guys, like, that's true even if Hannah the High Priestess, who's not a real person, by the way, Kelvin made that, maybe she is a real person. Kelvin, is she real? I don't know. Maybe I'm insulting somebody. But even if Hannah the High Priestess 2 states over and I are in the same tradition, like, her practice still has no bearing on what I'm doing. Like, it just doesn't, because that's what autonomy means. But I think because we're human and we have social brains, like, we latch on to this need to kind of be in line with others. And I think that's the downfall, and like that's the crux of this argument. And what I mean when I say that the obsession over realness and authenticity is hinged on this insecurity about who we are and what we're doing when we're alone. And it's something that I still wrestle with. I mean, I can kind of intellectualize it, right? But it doesn't mean I don't feel it emotionally. I don't know. I think it actually might even be tougher when you are part of an established movement, not necessarily like a formalized tradition, but like if you identify as a particular thing, you know, some kind of Wiccan or a traditional witch or whatever, like you're necessarily kind of putting yourself in comparison with other people internally, and like it's tricky because, you know, like we all die alone, and if it's like whatever you're doing has to be meaningful to you. And I don't know, what I've come to realize is that it doesn't matter so much that, you know, me and the girl I meet at the grocery store who identifies as a witch, like if we don't kind of overlap in what we mean by that term, like that's probably just fine, because I don't know, like I think that's just the nature of what we're doing. Like, I was having a conversation at Hexfest with Laura Tempest Zakroff, and one of the things she said, which probably deserves its own video, is that she didn't think that, she said it much more eloquently, and Tempest is an artist, and she's beautiful and she's dramatic, so I want to convey to you the flair with which she said this, instead of like the hacking dishevelment that you have before you right now in Thorn Mooney. But she said something to the effect of, the natural state of a witch isn't in a coven, isn't in a group. And we weren't talking about like covened witches versus solitary witches necessarily, but the idea of witches in groups, right? I mean, even the idea of like a witch festival is kind of weird if you really get down to it. Because I think what we're doing is fundamentally a solitary art. But I think kind of the power behind that statement, or like the lesson of that statement, is that ultimately you have to be secure in what you're doing by yourself. If there wasn't a hashtag, if you didn't have 8,000 followers, if you didn't like have whatever kind of your clout is in your community, whatever your social capital is, if you didn't have that, would you still have a meaningful practice? Would you still be doing something that grounded you in the world around you? Anyway, that's something that I'm kind of wrestling with now. And I confess that in part it's probably because for the last 2 weeks I've like physically felt like I'm dying. So, good Lord, I'm sorry. But you know, and like moving, and I've just kind of generally been in one of those states where this is what happens when you move and you start a new job and you're uprooted, and you know, like, oh God, like orient me in the world, somebody help. Like a lot of your kind of I don't know, your placeholders move and you have to find new ones. So take this with a grain of salt. But anyway, I'm gonna not talk now. I hope you guys are good, and I will see you soon.